N. Sreekumar is an assistant professor of philosophy in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, Indian Institute of Technology, Madras. He is a gold medalist for MA Philosophy from the Mahatma Gandhi University, Kottayam. He did his MPhil and PhD in Philosophy from the Central University of Hyderabad and specializes in the areas of philosophy of language, continental philosophy and hermeneutics. He has been into the academic profession since 1995 and is taught in Sri Shankaracharya University of Sanskrit, Kaladi, Kerala and BITS Pilani, Rajasthan before joining the IIT Madras in 2003. Dr. Sreekumar has published articles in various journals and has presented papers in national and international seminars. Some of the courses he offers include European Philosophy, Contemporary German Philosophy, Introduction to Indian Philosophy, Philosophical Hermeneutics, Philosophy and Critical Theory, and Philosophy of Language.
Welcome to the UGC lecture series in philosophy on Phenomenology and Existentialism, part 15. This episode will cover the following topics: intentional experience and the presentation of the object. So, there are certain technical terms which we will be using quite frequently when we discuss phenomenology. One of them is intentional experience, the notion of intentional experience, which we have already used several times in our previous episodes. Now again there is one more concept, the presentation of the object. The object as it is presented to the consciousness is a very vital notion in Husserl's phenomenology. So that is one concept which we will be briefly examining today. Intentional experience and the nature of the existence of the object. Here we have to talk about what the object is and in what way it is related to intentional experience. Then once again on consciousness. Consciousness is another term which we use very frequently in phenomenology and we will be revisiting it again and again. Consciousness and meaning, the notion of meaning. This is one of the central concepts in Husserl's phenomenology, the notion of meaning and how it is related to consciousness. Then meaning and phenomenology, then beyond subjectivism and objectivism. This is one issue which makes, or one aspect which makes phenomenology very relevant, because there is an attempt to go beyond these traditional dichotomy of subjectivism and objectivism. And finally noesis and noema, the concepts of noesis and noema. Again these two concepts are used by Husserl in order to counter subjectivism, or rather the program of going beyond subjectivism and objectivism. So he is using, or he is introducing new terminologies. Husserl and Frege's concept of sense. Frege's concept of sense has influenced Husserl a lot. So now we will see in this episode in what way Frege's concept of sense is related to Husserl's notion of sense and what modifications Husserl has made in this important concept about consciousness. As I said, consciousness is one term which we will be revisiting quite frequently, and it is related to object in the world and related to phenomena. Then again it is intentional. All these points we have already discussed. It is intentional, openness to, in relation to, and it is this relation is the foundational structure of consciousness. So I wanted to assert this factor again and again categorically, that the relational structure is so foundational to consciousness. Now we will see the structure of intentional experience, because phenomenology is concerned with experience and the objects given in experience and meaning. So let us see the structure of intentional experience slightly in detail. Intentional experiences direct us to the object which is present to us in an intentional sense. So this is the principle of intentionality visiting us again. Structure of intentional experience. An object is referred to or aimed at in presentative or judging experiences. This is what happens in every experience. It is referred to or aimed at in presentative or judging experiences. Again, certain experiences are present here. So we come across certain experiences here, and here we can see that there is a possibility of a dualism. On the one hand, you have the experience of the object, which everybody knows, which is a commonsensical notion, that when there is an experience of the object and the intentional experience directed upon the object. So, the principle of intentionality. So, by introducing the concept of intentionality or by asserting the intentional structure of consciousness, can we assume that Husserl is introducing a dualism between the experience of the object and the intentional experience directed upon the object. But Husserl is very clear about it. It is no, he denies the dualism categorically, and it consists in saying that only the intentional experience is present, nothing else. There is only one thing, that intentional experience, and phenomenology is concerned only about that. It is not concerned about the real experience of the objects which exist in the natural world. This aspect we will examine slightly in detail later. Now again, this is very important point. Intentional experience constitutes the full and sole presentation of the object. So there is nothing left. Once you have the intentional experience, it presents the object fully and completely. There is nothing left out. Now in experience, an intentional relation to the object is achieved. So gradually Husserl is explaining, or he is clarifying, what is that relationship between experience and the object. So he says that in experience an intentional relation to the object is achieved. Therefore the object is intentionally present, we can say the object is intentionally present, and phenomenology is concerned with the intentionally present object, not with, I repeat, as I said earlier, it is not concerned with objects in the world as such, but it is concerned with intentionally present objects, or in other words we can say that objects as they are given to the consciousness. Now what is this object? We have to clarify what you mean by this intentionally present object, and where do we find it, whether we find it in the world like other objects in the world, objects in the natural world like trees and flowers and all that, or we find it in our consciousness itself, whether it is internally existing inside us. So this has to be clarified, and here we have another concept, intentional experience and the existence of the object. So this relationship, this peculiar relationship has to be explained further. Experience and the object of experience and non-existent objects. See, for example, we can have non-existent objects. For example, Superman, the comic cine character Superman, who does not exist actually, but still we have it in our intentional experience. We can think about it, talk about him and all that. So he exists somewhere, or we can say that we experience him, we have an experience of Superman, though he does not exist in the external world like other human beings who exist in the world. So the non-existent objects and existing objects. So for example, an existing object, for example, is the great writer Leo Tolstoy, who existed. So we are talking about two individuals, one is a non-existent object, the other one is an existent object. So let us see what, as far as the intentional experience is concerned, what is the difference here? Is there any difference in the nature of intentionality as far as these two objects are concerned? So Husserl is very clear here. He says that the meaning of the object is an experience. If the meaning of the object is an experience, then the object is merely meant and is really nothing. For example, Superman. We have the Superman and he does not exist, as we all know, he exists as a comic cine character, not in the actual world, but still the meaning of, since the meaning of the object is an experience, the object merely meant, and though the object is only meant, does not exist like Superman, still we can talk about him. And Superman does not exist, yet the idea of Superman is a sort of experience. We can experience, we have the experience of Superman. We experience, I can say that Superman, the comic movie character, is present to me, about whom there are certain stories which I have read or I have seen in movies. I have a certain presentative experience or presentation of Superman through my since I have read stories about him. Now, this presentation is, Husserl says, realized in my consciousness, though there is no actual object existing in outside, the presentation of Superman is realized in my consciousness, and Superman is immanently present in my act. I can say he is immanently present and he has mental existence. He does not exist extramentally, but he exists inside my mind, and he can still be a particular sort of experience. Now, let us talk about Leo Tolstoy, the great Russian novelist Leo Tolstoy, who has written great novels like War and Peace, Anna Karenina, etc., etc. So, here we talk about a person who really existed, unlike Superman, who is a fictional character. If the object is something that exists, example the writer Leo Tolstoy, Husserl says, still there is no difference as far as my intentional experience is concerned. So, there is no phenomenological difference. This is one point which Husserl would emphasize on. As far as the experience of these two objects, one a real existent object like Leo Tolstoy, the other a non-existent comic fictional character like Superman. But as far as phenomenology is concerned, there is no phenomenological difference between their presentations and experience. So, now we will see, before we go to the next major issue, we will go through the analysis Husserl has made of Brentano's concept of consciousness. On Brentano, Brentano, as we have seen some episodes back, has emphasized on the division between psychical phenomena and physical phenomena, but Husserl was very careful. He avoided this distinction. He not only avoided the dichotomy between psychical and physical phenomena, but instead of using the term psychical phenomena, he used the term intentional experience. And intentionality, according to Husserl, is a very essence of consciousness. It is not just one aspect of consciousness, but it is a very essence of consciousness. And now again, essential characteristic of the sphere of experience in general, consciousness is understood as. So, it is consciousness gains a very central position in Husserl's phenomenology. It is the unique characteristic of experience to be consciousness of something, and a closer examination and analysis of consciousness and its intentional structure is what Husserl aims at. It is here we could see that he distinguishes its domain from other domains like the physical domain, etc., and viewing consciousness in relationship with the notion of meaning. Since the concept of meaning or sense is so central to phenomenology, Husserl is trying to view the notion of consciousness in relation with this concept. So, now we will see what is consciousness very closely. Consciousness, there is something present to us which is not a thing. So, when we examined the concept of consciousness, the notion of consciousness, or rather the phenomenon of consciousness, we could see that there is something present to us which is not a thing like objects and people in the world, but it is something which we can say our own self awareness, which is different from other objects, other people, and we ourselves, because we ourselves are phenomenologically quote unquote objects. Then the thoughts that we are thinking, what we call consciousness. So, what is consciousness is being answered in this way. We have two regions of being now, the physical being and the psychological being, and both are parts of nature. And consciousness is, as Husserl would repeatedly emphasize, is intimately related with the concept of meaning or with meaning as such. The subjective content, say for example, if you talk about the subjective content of our thoughts, which is not identical what is occurring in our brain, we have to understand it in that way. It is not something which is identical to what occurs in our brain, and the meaning that I am aware of when I think or imagine about something cannot be reduced to the brain activity going on at the moment of thinking or imagining. So, we can say that a brain scanning, an MRI scanning or a CT scanning will never bring in the aspect of meaning. It can only tell you physically what is happening inside the brain, probably the implications of certain highly complicated chemical biological reactions, but it can never show you the meaning. It can never be reduced to these activities, to the brain activities. Then what is it? The meaning constitute a totally different sphere and it appears in consciousness. So, now we will see in what way phenomenology is concerned with meaning. So, phenomenology asks the question, is meaning something merely subjective, because it comes from my consciousness? If meaning is linked with my consciousness, then is what is meaningful is only meaningful for me? So, this leads to a kind of extreme subjectivism, meaning whether anything is actually real out there, quote unquote, whether there is anything out there, or if that is the case, if there is something which is out there, then in that case it does not have a meaning. So, these are some of the issues which we have to examine, and if it has meaning, then from where does it come from, and does it come from the thing itself? So, this is a realistic position. If the meaning comes from the thing itself, then it is realism, and instead if it is given by me from my consciousness, then it is something which is subjective. So, we have to really we have to really think about all these issues in detail. Does meaning that is immanent to consciousness determines, shapes or constitutes our relation to the object, or does this lead to subjectivism? So, these are the issues to be analyzed, and here as a phenomenologist, as a philosopher who is looking for presuppositionless philosophy, or who is actually trying to come up with a foundation for all philosophical and scientific enterprises, Husserl has to counter subjectivism. He has to somehow go beyond subjectivism. So, countering subjectivism to show that the individual consciousness already contains in itself objective content. So, this is a primary task for Husserl. Here on the one hand, he has to preserve the role of consciousness in the acquisition of meaning, in knowing, and on the other hand he has to somehow prove that objectivity or at least intersubjectivity is possible, otherwise science would become impossible. So, to show that the individual consciousness already contains in itself objective content. So, it is in this way Husserl is trying to solve the whole problem, by showing that the individual consciousness already contains in itself the objective contents about which phenomenology is concerned. And here this objective content is the basis of our intersubjective world, and overcoming the subjectivism objectivism debate beyond objectivism and subjectivism. So, there is a famous book by Richard Bernstein, Beyond Objectivism and Relativism. Here it is beyond subjectivism and objectivism. So, somehow he has to counter and go beyond that. And here the primary concern is that we could see that Husserl is not interested in the actual subject that is seeing the object, the psychological subject who sees the object. So, he overcomes the psychological problem, and again he is not interested in the object itself, the object in the world as the tree, the book, the computer, etc. The object as such in the world, he is not interested even in that. As we have seen earlier, he is interested in the object that is given to consciousness. So, how to reach that object, that is a problem here, and objects as meant. So, this is what he is coming to, that object, he is concerned of the object as meant and the intentional act that presents the object as meant. So, there is a distinction between the act and the content of the act, the noesis noema distinction. So, it is here, in order to explain this distinction clearly, Husserl introduces these two technical terms, noesis and noema, to distinguish between the object as meant, which is a noema, and the intentional act that presents the object that meant, which is called the noesis or the noetic acts. And in his later work, Ideas, one of his seminal works, Ideas, Husserl speaks about noesis and noema. It is here he introduces these two terms instead of intentional acts and its contents, the terms which he used earlier. Now he uses the terms noesis and noema, and this distinction describes the essence of consciousness. So, it is in one way to really bring out, to expose the essence of consciousness. Husserl brings out, or he introduces these technical terms and their interrelationships, and it is similar to the intentional relation described in his earlier work, Logical Investigations. Noesis and noema, again, to go beyond the distinction between subject and object, and the subject object distinction, as we could see, it is tied up with the old difference between the physical and psychological sphere of nature. So, again, if you really focus on this distinction, you will be back or to all the epistemological worries, epistemological problematic with which the modern philosophy is concerned with. To overcome this epistemological worry is one of the major concerns of Husserl, and the noema and noesis is what remains. Now, in Husserl's terminology, this is what remains of the subject and object after the application of phenomenological method. The phenomenological method, which is essentially a method of reduction, we will see later, because that is again, that probably would be the natural conclusion which Husserl takes us in his whole idea of phenomenology. And here we have two aspects of consciousness. The first one is the process of experiencing. We are coming back, we are again going to discuss in detail the distinction between noesis and noema. So, here we have the two aspects of consciousness. The first one is the process of experiencing, and the second one is stable something which is experienced. So, here we could see a reminiscence of the traditional epistemological distinctions, but here Husserl is emphasizing on the process of experience and something which is experienced, the act and the content, which is later called as noesis and noema, and it is not the real unreduced object, which is what is called this stable something which is experienced. This is not the real unreduced object, but rather it is a phenomenon as meant, and here consciousness is always meaningful. There is always something being meant beyond the process of meaning. So, again, there is something which is beyond merely the process of meaning, there is something which is meant, a content about which you talk about. So, it really, the whole process of experience, the whole process of meaning, judging, and whatever actions we do, they really take us beyond what we are doing, beyond the act, to something which is meant, remembered, liked, etc. Meaning, we have to explain the concept of meaning in proper. It is an active process which involves something that I do, I mean so and so, I relate to it, that something, and I take a stand about that something. So, here we are talking about meaning, and it means something to me, or else it would not be present to me at all. So, since it is present to me, it means something to me. So, Husserl would rather say that, say for example, to clarify this point, let us consider the following conversation between two individuals. Let us name them A and B. It is a conversation between them to clarify the concept of meaning. A says, do you know who is that gentleman? B, oh yes, he is my classmate Arjun's father. A, but he is the vice chancellor of our university. Now, B says, I did not know that. See, what is important here is, it is what the phenomenon means for me that counts in experiencing, and that is the meaning that I give it. So, the noesis, the concept of noesis, the concept of act, the act of experiencing, the act of meaning, which becomes central to phenomenological project here. The term noesis is derived from the Greek word nous, which stands for intellect or mind, and noesis means the Greek for the operations of nous, thinking as opposed to sensing, and the intentive mental process. This is what is meant by noesis. And noetic processes are, there are some processes like perceiving, believing, valuing, etc. These can be understood as noetic processes. Now we will see the distinction again, act and content distinction. So, my meaning of something must be distinguished from that which I mean, something which I have already explained. So, the act has to be distinguished from the content. The act of meaning giving is distinguished from that which is meant, the content. And here again it is based on the German mathematician, logician and philosopher of language Gottlob Frege, who introduced the seminal distinction in philosophy of language, the distinction between sense and reference. Husserl seems to have been influenced by this Fregean distinction. Frege has introduced this concept of sense and reference. He introduces every expression for him has got a sense and a reference. The sense is nothing but the way the object is presented, and the reference stands for the object as such, the object in the world. So, we are talking about sense and reference. Frege, for example, is in one way Husserl is different from Frege, because Frege is a philosopher of language and is confined to language. This distinction between sense and reference is confined to language. He is concerned about the sense and reference of linguistic expressions, but in Husserl it is not just confined to language, but to any experience. According to Husserl, has got a sense as well as a reference. All acts of will, of perception, emotion, etc. have sense, and makes all consciousness, not just language, meaningful. So, what makes something meaningful is the sense that is given to it, and here the notion of intentionality is introduced in relation with this concept of sense again. It claims that consciousness always has a sense, and it is this sense which is responsible for the intentionality, and we never experience brute existence. See, Husserl says we never experience brute existence, but every experience has some meaning for us. So, the sense is built into every experience, like what Frege said. But what he says is that nature impinges on us only with respect. We bestow meaning, the meaning is given by us. We will once again say the notion of sense as it is discussed by Frege and Husserl. Frege's sense is retained with modification by Husserl, and Frege's reference is suspended, because according to Frege, reference is an object in the natural world, and this any reference to objects in the natural world is being suspended by Husserl's phenomenological project, which we are going to see in the coming episodes. So, Frege's reference is suspended by invoking the notion of reduction, and the psychological processes about which Frege also discusses, and the meanings are kept. Meanings are nothing but the senses, and by reduction the domain of meaning is specified. So, Husserl, by introducing the method of reduction, isolates the meanings, isolates the domain of sense, and we could now focus on them, which are going to be the foundation of all knowledge later. So, now it is based on this notion of noesis and noema are further discussed. Noesis, the process of meaning, and noema, that which is meant, the act and the content. And here we can see that when we see the concept of, or rather the concepts of noesis and noema from the perspective of the experiencer, we could see that experiences and we could see that experiencing constitute noesis and the experienced constitutes noema. And if you see it from the perspective of the cogito, we could see that the cogitations constitute the noesis while cogitata constitute noema. And before we conclude, let us summarize what we have discussed in this episode. I was focusing on the notion of meaning, because this is going to be a central concept which we are going to discuss in the coming episodes, and the analysis of consciousness and its intentional relation was another concept, another issue which we have discussed in detail in the present episode, and the noesis noema distinction to analyze the intentional relationship. So, we will be discussing this noesis noema distinction in detail in the coming episodes. So, now the students can take up the following questions. What is intentional relationship? Number 2, in what way Husserl's notion of meaning differs from Frege's concept of sense? Number 3, what is noesis? And number 4, what is noema? So, with this we will conclude this episode. Thank you.